For this tutorial, we will alter a portrait to have a more gritty effect. So this is the opposite of the airbrush tutorial where we were smoothing away certain features. In this tutorial, we're going to exaggerate and emphasize some of the imperfections and the roughness in the face and in the landscape. And I chose this photograph of my husband hiking on vacation because I felt that even though this is a nice portrait and it's got a nice smooth sort of glowing light, that I can make it feel a little more outdoorsy and rustic and more true to what it felt like to be there at that time. So I'm going to do a whole bunch of steps that I'll show you here. And we're going to start by making a duplicate background layer. Now, I'm not doing my usual non-destructive image editing where I have a single background layer isolated from the adjustments. What I did is I actually saved a copy of this to work on, so I have my original that's untouched, and this is the copy I'm making adjustments on, because I will need to really work heavily with layers, and a background layer with an unedited version of the file on it would just get in the way for these purposes. So I am going to start by making a duplicate layer. So I'll just drag my background down to the new layer icon. And now I have my background copy. And I'm going to apply a filter to this. And we're going to go down to Filter and Other and choose High Pass. And it's already set for us at 5, but you can see as we turn things up and down, it has a different effect. I want to do this at 5. And what 5 is doing is it's really hardening a lot of the edges, defining the lines, and adjusting the contrast. Now, obviously, I don't want it to look like this in the end result because this is going to look still somewhat natural. So I'm going to use a blending mode to make this look a little more natural. What the blending modes do, you can find these in the Layers palette. You'll see a normal and there'll be a drop-down menu. These modes will take the top layer and the layer below it and it'll blend them together. And to get an idea of what each one looks like, you may want to just scroll through and see what they look like when they're applied, because they blend the two layers together in different ways. I'm going to go ahead and use Overlay for this one. And I'll just turn off this layer so you can see before and after. It just hardened up the edges of everything. It took some of the softness out of the photo. It added a little bit of contrast. Now I'm going to make another duplicate of my original layer. And it winds up in the middle. I need this on the top, so I can click and just drag it up to the top. Here we go. And we're going to desaturate this. We're going to take all of the color out of this layer. So this is only affecting the layer when I do this. So we're going Image, Adjustments, and Desaturate. And I'm going to blend again. And I'm going to use a different blending mode this time. I'm going to use Hard Light. There we go. And if I turn this off, you can see what it did. So this took some of the saturation away from certain areas, so it has a little more of a sort of steel blue look to it in certain areas, and it has a deeper contrast and darkness in some of the shadows. And now I'm going to flatten these 3 layers so that they become one individual layer. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be able to apply more layers and blend them together and have my original 3 adjustments affected by those changes. So I needed to put all of those 3 adjustments into one layer so they're equally affected by the newer layers and the blending of those layers. So I'm going to duplicate my merged background layer. So I have another copy. And I'm going to apply the high pass filter again. That's the first filter we did. And so I can either go back down to Other and choose High Pass and put my settings in, but the last filter you use is always right at the top, and you can choose that and it'll just reapply the filter in the same way with the same adjustments as you did before. So I can save myself a little time by clicking that, and we see the High Pass layer again, so I'll turn that off, before, after, and I'm going to blend it again because I want it to look more natural than this. And I'm going to choose Overlay for my blending mode one more time. So you could see that just by adding High Pass one more time, it really exaggerates the pores in the skin, the texture in the skin, the outline of the hair, the stubble on the face. All of these things are more defined and more exaggerated than in the original. And I'm going to flatten one more time so that each change I apply after this is applied to both layers evenly. So we'll flatten the image. And from here, I'm not actually going to do any changes, any more changes to make a greater gritty effect. I'm just going to add a couple of little embellishments to this photo to emphasize other areas that I want to bring out. The first thing I want to do is, if you notice this, the lens of the sunglasses, one of the reasons I took this photo is because I like the reflection of the landscape my husband was looking at in his glasses. But it's not very prominent at the moment, so I want to bring that out. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to my adjustment layers, and I'm going to grab a curves layer, and I'm going to make an adjustment to really bring out the reflection in the lens. I'm going to ignore everything else that happens in the photo while I'm doing this, because I'm going to fix that later. So I'm just going to maybe brighten up some of the shadows, maybe some of the midtones a little bit. There we go. So it's a little brighter and a little bit more contrast there. And now I'm going to invert the layer. And the way you can do that is if you do Control-I on the keyboard, Command-I on a Mac. Now, the adjustment went away, but I'm going to bring it back in this small isolated area. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my brush tool. I'm going to make sure the opacity is at 100%. I'm going to make sure that the hardness is turned down at 0% so the edges are feathered and blended. And I'm just going to paint in the lens here. So this is how you can apply just part of a curves adjustment using layer masks. And I'm just bringing back that curves adjustment to this small area in the lens. And if you actually look in the layer mask on the curves adjustment layer, you can see that little area that I painted show up in white. All right. And then the final thing I'm going to do is put some color into the landscape. So in doing this, if we go back and look at our original, there's some warmth and some orange tones in the cliffs back here. And I want to add that in and actually exaggerate how much of that warmth is in the photo. So I'm going to start by applying another layer over the top, and I'm not going to do a duplicate layer this time. I'm going to make a brand new layer. It'll be an empty layer. And I'm going to set the blending mode for color. And what this will allow me to do is it'll allow me to paint with the brush into the scene without losing any of the shadow or texture or detail in the area I'm painting. That will show through. So I've got my brush selected, it's at 100%, that's good. I'm going to keep the edges feathered, I like to work that way. And I'm going to hold down the Alt key, Option if you're on a Mac, and I'm just going to find a little bit of orange in the cliffs and click on that for my orange tone. I make my brush a little bigger, and I'm going to start painting. So you can see how, as I'm painting, it still shows the detail in the cliffs. Now if I change my blending mode back to normal, you can see what it actually looks like. This is not blending the color that you're painting with the background. You can see that it actually bleeds over a little bit into the highlight. The color tool actually won't work here when it's set to the color blending mode, which is good because that saves me from accidentally painting into the sky. So I'm going to go back and put this on color again so that it's blended. And I'm just going to paint this cliff in the background. I might have to zoom in a little bit to paint around the nose. I'm going to make my brush a little smaller to get around this area. I'm not so worried about the little hairs sticking up because those would reflect some of that color back anyway. So it's okay if those are tinted. Same thing with here. I'm not worried too much about these little flyaway hairs. They can take on the color of the cliffs. Okay. And I might just go in and paint in a couple little splashes of color over here, being careful not to paint over the trees because I don't want those to have that orange tint. Those should remain green. Just adding a little bit of color over here. All right, and if that feels a little bit heavy-handed, like that to me feels just slightly unnatural, I can bring down the opacity a little bit to blend it further while still maintaining a little bit of that color. So we could look at before and after. And then once I'm done, I'm going to flatten everything together so I have my completed image. And that is a gritty portrait. So let's take a look at our first image there, and our exaggerated, gritty, outdoorsy portrait in the end.